So the topic of science, modernity, and the post-human. My background is as a medic and as a research scientist at UCL, but I've become increasingly interested in the challenges as science advances to what it means to be human. I can trace this question, which comes back time and time again through my own career and in the field of medical ethics. And as we look at that, we see that as you look back in the history of ideas, it's very clear that we've always tried to understand what it means to be human by reference to the leading technology of the age, of the culture. So if you go back to the medieval period and then the early Enlightenment, it was clockwork, precision clockwork, which was the most advanced technology. So lo and behold, a human being must be something like a clockwork mechanism. And here's Denis Diderot saying his heart is the mainspring and his head are the bells, complete with little hammers. And the soul is a tiny figure on the top, listening to the music of the chimes. So in the Enlightenment period, the idea of the clockwork brain, the clockwork mechanism, was very dominant in the writings of the time. But then you get the rise of steam power and the Industrial Revolution, and hydraulics becomes the new technology. And lo and behold, the human body must be something made of hydraulics. There's little tubes, there's pressures, the idea of the lymphatics, the circulation, and so on. In fact, even the Freudian understanding of the psyche, of psychodynamics, it's often been pointed out that fundamentally it's a hydraulic metaphor. There's this incompressible fluid called libido, and it builds up, and then it comes bursting out in lots of different ways. So it's basically hydraulics of the soul, of the spirit. So then along comes Helmholtz, and he's fascinated by telegraphy and the idea perhaps that the nervous system represents some profoundly complex switchboard with messages being passed down through wires and so on. Now we live in a world where the most advanced kind of technology is the supercomputer. And surprise, surprise, the human brain, the human mind must be a supercomputer. It's just the same process of taking the most advanced technology of the time. But it's a very dominant metaphor at the time. This is Daniel Dennett, well known. We are not just robots. We're robots made of robots made of robots. In this digital age of supercomputers and smartphones, surely it isn't difficult to imagine how a machine made up of trillion moving parts might just be capable of being human. Marvin Minsky puts it in cruder terms. The brain happens to be a meat machine. And it's interesting, there is a trend, I think, that secular thinkers are keen to understand the brain as nothing more than a computer because it reassures them that there's nothing mysterious or somehow transcendent, weird about human thinking and conscious awareness. The first thinker who made a connection between computation and thinking was actually Thomas Hobbes, very presciently back in the 17th century. In Leviathan, his well-known book, he says, "For reason is nothing but reckoning, that is, adding and subtracting of the consequences of general names agreed upon for the marking and signifying of our thoughts." So Steven Pinker, commenting on this, is quite significant. Thomas Hobbes' pithy equation of reasoning as nothing but reckoning is one of the great ideas in human history. The cognitive feats of the brain can be explained in physical terms. To put it crudely, and critics notwithstanding, we can say that beliefs are a kind, here's the metaphor, beliefs are a kind of information, thinking is a kind of computation, and motivation a kind of feedback and control. This is a great idea because it completes a naturalistic understanding of the universe, exorcising occult souls, spirits, ghosts in the machine. Just as Darwin made it possible for a thoughtful observer of the natural world to do without creationism, Turing and others made it possible for a thoughtful observer of the cognitive world to do without spiritualism. So you see the point. This metaphor is more than just a chance metaphor. It's an extremely attractive metaphor to secularists because it allows me to stop worrying about the fact there could be something weird, something inexplicable about what it means to be human. Having said that, this question of what it means to be human is something that continues to engage secular thinkers and workers in this field. And so one of the things the obvious opportunities for those of us who are Christians and who wish to engage in these questions is that this question of what it means to be human is very much on the agenda in the field of science, particularly AI, robotics, neuroscience, and so on. Here's just one example. This interesting character called Professor Ishiguro in Osaka University in Japan. He specializes in making incredibly lifelike humanoid robots, and in particular making humanoid robots which are designed to look like recognizable human beings, including himself. So he's created this humanoid robot. Apparently he sends it to lectures and it gives lectures for him. But interestingly, when asked why he did it, he says, one of the major goals of my project is to understand what a human being is like. So that question of what it means to be human is very much on the agenda in this field. But behind it, there lies a deep, deep confusion, the confusion between what is a metaphor and what is, to use philosophical language, an ontological description. There's all the difference in the world to say that the human brain is like a machine versus to say that the human brain is a machine. And of course, there are many aspects of the human brain which are machine-like. It turns out to be an extremely useful metaphor. So, for instance, many disciplines such as computational neuroscience, cognitive neuropsychology, and so on are based on this basic metaphor that there is something about the way the brain functions which is similar to the way that a computer functions. And so machine metaphors can be extremely productive, extremely helpful. But where it all goes wrong is where you move on and say, therefore, the brain is a machine. And that, frankly, is simply incoherent. The definition of a machine is a device which is created by human beings for human purposes. So whatever else you can say about the brain, it is not a machine. And yet that confusion seems to be completely ubiquitous. It's everywhere within the culture and in the language. Some people are regarding this, the invention of artificial intelligence and the creation of these so-called minds, and incidentally, once you talk about an artificial mind, there's another example of a metaphor. These things are not minds. Only human beings have minds. But when you say an artificial mind, you're using a metaphor, but then collapsing it into a description, a definition. Martin Rees, who is very well known as an astronomer, says abstract thinking by biological brains has underpinned the emergence of all culture and science. But this activity, spanning tens of millennia at most, will be a brief precursor to the more powerful intellects of the inorganic post-human era. So Rees and others, looking forward into the future, they see that actually humanity is so fragile and limited it's going to burn itself out. But long after we've either blown ourselves up or just died in some extinction event, the machines that we create will continue to develop and will basically pass out through the solar system and then through the cosmos. And in fact, some people are suggesting these machines are our real children. People talk rather dismissively about our meat children. Our meat children are always going to be limited and have the same limitations as we have. Our real children are our mind children, and these are the machines we create that will continue to investigate the cosmos and so on long after we've gone. So compared with the limitations of human intelligence, advancing machine intelligence actually starts to seem desirable and increasingly better suited to the modern world. So it's interesting, we all know the left-hand side of this diagram, the common dominant narrative of life emerging from the primeval swamps by a combination of chance and necessity. But until recently, these diagrams ended at Homo sapiens, the final evolution, the end of the evolutionary tree. What's fascinating is that increasingly People are speculating that, in fact, Homo sapiens is not the end of the evolutionary tree, and that either there will be some kind of merging with technology, or that ultimately it will be the pure technology which will be the next stage of evolution, the mind children. In fact, some people are suggesting that Homo sapiens is basically a boot program for artificial intelligence. I don't know if you know what a boot program is. When you switch on a computer, there's a small bit of code which operates first, which then starts the main code. And so that's the boot program. And so here is the idea. In the broad sweep of evolution, Homo sapiens is just the boot program. We are just the biological precursor to get the artificial intelligence started. But once it gets started and recreating itself, then it's going to go on. So there's a grand narrative, a new grand narrative. And related to that is this fascinating phenomenon, which I suggest you should be on the lookout for, because it's happening time and time again. Many technological thinkers express a form of disgust at their own human embodiment. And here are just a few examples of the sort of things which you can often find in popular science writing. We are pathetic, ludicrous, laughable bipeds. We're only fit for survival on the African savanna. Our bodies are a pathetic hodgepodge of partly functioning biological engineering, subject to frequent breakdown, inexorable decline. Our brains are dominated by reptilian reflexes from our biological ancestors, frequently functioning in inappropriate ways, so maladapted to modern society. Our information processing capacity is limited, subject to frequent errors. Every time we access a memory, we distort it and change the encoded file. Our perceptions of reality are highly distorted. Our brains create an imaginary reality for survival purposes. So it seems to me that digital technology constantly devalues some of the most profound realities of humanity. And in particularly the centrality of human embodiment, of being a physical person with a body located in a physical time and space. And so one of the foundational realities of all digital technology is that it's disembodied. It encourages disembodied communication, instantaneous transfer of information, multiplication, storage, processing. And I think this is a very profound reality which hasn't had enough attention so far. And I'll come back to it because it feeds into some deep spiritual ideas. There's an increasing secular tendency to regard the human body as limited, outdated, crude, inferior, compared to sophisticated information processing machines. But one of the fascinating things is how disembodiment in the digital world almost encourages the emergence of terrible evil. So Mark Zuckerberg says, you know what, we're going to connect every single human being on the planet. What could possibly go wrong? And I think, Mark Zuckerberg, certainly the early Mark Zuckerberg, represents the kind of naivety of Silicon Valley. A sort of hippie culture, open source, information wants to be free, peace, truth, love, man. But then, what has history shown us? Just the very fact of allowing disembodied digital communication between human beings has led to the most astonishing outpouring of evil, of those terrible evil things of trolling and cybercrime and media abuse and broken relationships and internet scams. And people have died. There have been vast evils. And why is that? Why should just communicating human beings together lead to such profound evil? Well, I'm sure there's all sorts of reasons, but I increasingly think that one of the factors is the very disembodiment of digital communication. That, interestingly, our embodied nature means that the potential evil in our communication, in our relationships, is limited. It's limited by the fact that we are in space and time. So anyway, techno-optimism is one of the dominant forces. Its fons is Silicon Valley, but it's spreading out of Silicon Valley across the world. And it creates a vision of the future in which human enhancement and intelligent machines enable every aspect of life to become frictionless. Again, that's a word to look out for. Time and time again, the digital creators are trying to make our lives frictionless. Every desire, every longing, every interest will be satisfied instantly and effortlessly in the techno-enhanced digital and virtual realms. That's the dream. That's where Silicon Valley and all that's their dreams of the future. A lot of it created by science fiction. And those of you, for instance, who know the Ian M. Banks culture novels, where people live in the distant future, and basically they're idle, they have no real purpose apart from having enormously techno-enhanced orgies, satisfying their various curiosities. This is the kind of vision which drives some of the Silicon Valley pioneers. And so the question is that a future in which embodied human beings can flourish and find their ultimate meaning, their telos? And I just recommend on passing this excellent new book by Craig Gay, Modern Technology and the Human Future. It's not an easy read, but he really engages with some of these issues at a deep theological, philosophical level. So that question of what kind of future, there's a good question for discussion with our secular colleagues. What kind of future are we looking for? What kind of world are we trying to build for our children? Is it a world of a frictionless world in which every desire is going to be satisfied by these beneficent machines? Is it a world in which, by technological enhancement, we can satisfy every whim and desire that we should have? And of course, enhancement of our biological humanity is a very real phenomenon. This is modafinil. It's the sort of first generation of cognitive enhancers. As you can see, it does remarkable things to you. It makes you look like that. It makes your teeth very white, apparently. But seriously, people have been, various studies have shown that large amounts of the academic community are taking drugs like modafinil and others in order to enhance their abilities to pass exams and have creative ideas and so on. So this is an idea whose time has arrived, that that just our unaided brains are not going to be good enough in the competition for originality and creativity and all the rest, and we should use whatever drugs there are available. It's also, drugs seem to be touted for suppressing and obliterating unpleasant memories. So it's being suggested that, before soldiers go into war or where people are going to be exposed to horrific, traumatizing incidents, they can take medication which will basically protect them from being traumatized. So we can manipulate our ability to form memories and to minimize adverse consequences by using pharmaceuticals. The US military are funding development of memory implants which wire directly into the hippocampus, the memory centers in the brain. And this is an example of what's called dual-use technology. So the technology is partly being used for Army veterans with brain damage who suffer memory problems. But the very same technology can potentially be used in healthy soldiers in order to enhance them so that they would have direct access through their brains to memories or information implanted. And so we shouldn't be surprised that one of the major funders for human enhancement on the planet is the US military. And the US military have basically worked out that they're never going to be able to beat the alternative regimes that are rising in the world by sheer numerical superiority. So the only hope for the American military is that one of ours has got to be worth 10 of theirs. And that means enhancing soldiers and military to make them as effective war machines as possible. One of the fascinating things in the current world of transhumanism and AI is this crosstalk between science fiction and what's actually happening. So going back to those culture series, Ian M. Banks came up with the idea of what he called neural lace. And this was a fine network of mesh of wires which would be inserted underneath the skull and which would then allow the human brain to communicate at very high levels of bandwidth with computers and so on. So Elon Musk, the well-known entrepreneur, says, well, I'm going to make that happen. And he's set up a company to invest some of his vast resources to make a science fiction idea come true. And that is happening repeatedly, that these ideas that start off in science fiction then become something that the technologies want to try and make come true. So I've already mentioned this is DARPA creating and preventing strategic surprise. So you can go onto their website and you can see they're quite open about the different kinds of research they're doing into human enhancement. But it reminds me of those prescient words of C.S. Lewis, man's power over nature turns out to be power exerted by some men over other men. So this technology is never neutral. We should always ask, what are the power games? Who is funding this? What are they motivated by? What's driving it? A lot of it is, in the West, is laissez-faire capitalism. It's maximizing shareholder value. There's a very interesting and excellent book by a lady called Zuboff, who's written an excellent book about, she calls it surveillance capitalism. She says this is a new kind of capitalism, the way that Google and Facebook and these other companies are operating. So that's driven by commercial interests, pure old-fashioned capitalism. But there's also, as we said, there's DARPA, the US military. In China, which is rapidly becoming the other main AI superpower, this is all being driven by the Communist Party, and above all their desire for social control and also ultimately for global dominance. But very often it's consumerism which is driving this, and I often find this in the area of medical ethics, this potent combination between consumerism that says I want, moral relativism that says, well, why not? What's wrong with it? And then technology that says we can make your dreams come true, but it will cost you. And so we're seeing these different forces all conspiring together to make a very potent mix. In terms of transhumanism, this is a wonderful, sometimes almost comic, transhumanist manifesto written by Max Moore, but it's for the Transhumanist Association, and it's a letter to Mother Nature. And I haven't time to go into it in detail, but just to scan it very quickly. Amendment number 1. We've decided that it's time to amend the human constitution. We will no longer tolerate the tyranny of aging and death through genetic alterations and so on and so on. We'll remove our expiration date. We will each decide for ourselves how long we shall live. Amendment number 2 will expand our perceptual range through biotechnological and computational means. We seek to exceed the perceptual abilities of any other creature, derive neural senses, improve on our neural organization and capacity. We'll supplement the neocortex with a metabrain. This will allow us to modulate our emotions. We'll no longer be slaves to our genes. We will seek complete choice of our bodily form and function. We will cautiously yet boldly reshape our motivational patterns and emotional responses. People like Glyn Harrison will become completely obsolete because we'll do it through technology. We will strengthen ourselves so we can let go of unhealthy needs for dogmatic certainty, removing emotional barriers to rational self-correction. We recognize your genius in using carbon-based compounds. This is Mother Nature. Yet we will not limit our physical, intellectual, and emotional capacities by remaining purely biological organisms. While we pursue mastery of our own biochemistry, we will increasingly integrate our advancing technologies into ourselves. These amendments to our Constitution will transition us from a human to post-human condition as individuals. We believe that individual transhumanizing will also allow us to form relationships, cultures, polities of unprecedented innovation, richness, freedom, responsibility. We reserve the right to make further amendments, collectively and individually. Rather than seek a state of final perfection, we will continue to pursue new forms of excellence according to our own values and as technology allows, signed your ambitious human offspring. So there's a statement. So here's a diagram from a book about transhumanism. This is the space of all possible modes of being, and this is where we are at the moment, in this tiny, pathetic little bit. This is all we can do as humans. Some animals do better than us. This is accessible by transhumans, but ultimately we're going to be able to explore this space, set free from this tiny little constriction of being human. Just as an aside, I highlighted some of the interesting phrases in there which were all about autonomy, about choice, the right of self-governance. I make my own laws. So in modern liberal thinking, it's the autonomy of the self which gives personhood its value. It's choice that is the ultimate essence of our humanity. And so in transhumanist thinking, it's the exercise of individual autonomy, the choosing self. It's at the heart of the enterprise to create the post-human. I choose what to do with my body. Now, if you stop and think about this, this is very interesting because this is classic dualism. There's an internal self, which is a kind of mystical choosing thing, and then there's the body on which the mystical self operates. And yet, hang on a minute, isn't there a problem with that? Well, of course there's a problem, and physicalists are pointing it out repeatedly and ferociously. Here's Susan Blackmore. There are three interlinked issues: self, consciousness, and free will. I think they're all illusions. Matt Ridley, there is no me inside my brain. There's only an ever-changing set of brain states, a distillation of history, emotion, instinct, experience, and influence, not to mention chance. Francis Crick's famous words: you, your joys and your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. So there's a profound problem here. On the one hand, autonomy, choice, is being lauded as the supreme value of all liberal democracies, the supreme value behind life, and also the supreme driving force for transhumanism. And yet, at the same time, neuroscience is saying there ain't no such thing. It's an illusion. There is no self. They can't both be true. I think there's a profound incoherence between these two things. And it's interesting how rarely people face it, how rarely people are honest about this problem. Human beings do choose, and as they choose, they change the universe. And yet, what physicalism says and what physics says is that that cannot be true. There is nothing inside. The brain is simply operating according to causal sequences and causal mechanisms. There is no genuine choice. So it's interesting that crux, that issue, is something which is causing scientists, philosophers, and so on real concern, because it's a real issue. And of course, it's a way in for us as Christians to ask the question, what does it mean to be human? I just want to point out these low-tech transhumanism, which is already happening. These things like cosmetic surgery, mood-enhancing drugs, gender fluidity, transitioning, genetic doping, anti-aging therapies, and so on, they're all versions of the same transhumanist drive, this belief that my body as it is inadequate, and I've got to use technology to change my body. So this fundamental discontent with the human condition. So what lies behind modernity's deep sense of dissatisfaction with the limitations of the human condition? As I move now towards the end to think of some Christian reflections about this. And these wonderful verses, well-known verses in Ecclesiastes: he has made everything beautiful in its time. Also, he has put eternity into man's heart, yet so that he cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. So I think we can see these transhumanist longings this sense of deep dissatisfaction with humanity as it is. You can almost hear them saying, there must be more. There must be more to these dreams that I have, these longings, these sense of all the possibilities of human existence, trapped in this tiny, pathetic little biological frame. There must be more. And of course, this is where the Christian hope says some remarkable things, because what the Christian hope promises are some mind-boggling possibilities for the Christian, for the human body. So in 1 Corinthians 15, every aspect of our humanity, including our physical human body, is going to be transformed, is going to be changed. Transformation of human knowledge and awareness and consciousness. When the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. Now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Have you reflected on the awesome significance of those words? What we are being promised is that we will have the degree of knowledge and understanding which God himself has of us. That level, that extraordinary level where every hair of our head is known, where every possible alternative and meaning and significance is known. That is what we are promised. Then we shall know, even as we are fully known. The ultimate defeat of death, pain, and suffering. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death shall be no more. Neither shall be no mourning, nor crying, nor pain. Transformation of society and human relationships. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall when the letter to Ephesus was being first read out from Paul. And you can imagine them hearing this letter being read out. And the person reading it out says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound. And they're all going, yes, Paul, it is. It's a profound mystery. And I'm talking about Christ and the church. What? Christ and the church is really what the mystery of one flesh is. Is that what we're being promised? That level of unity with Christ himself, that cosmic Christ that Matt talked, is what we're being promised. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Behold, I am making all things new. But the newness of the new creation is not the newness of a fresh start. It's actually the newness of renovation. God is taking what he has already made and renewing it. He's using the raw material of the first creation to create the new creation. So here's the Christian hope for the future. And there's a remarkable overlap with the transhumanist dreams. Just look at that and compare that with Max Moore's letter to Mother Nature. So the Christian hope actually, or the transhumanist dreams, represent a kind of secular version of the Christian hope. But I also am very intrigued, going back to this theme of the denigration of the human body. If you go back to the early centuries of the Christian church, the phenomenon of ancient Gnosticism, a mystery religion with very complex roots, which was invading the church. You can see early forms of it already in the New Testament, but over the next 2 or 3 centuries, it became a very major force. And Gnosticism saw the human body as fundamentally evil. In fact, they talked about death as the moment of resurrection. Death was the point at which the vital spiritual spark, trapped in this horrific pit of the human body, could then escape into the spiritual realm. And so they promoted a kind of esoteric spiritual wisdom which was intended to overcome and transcend the body. But the interesting thing is that the early church fathers saw Gnosticism as a very dangerous threat, and they spent a lot of time and energy writing and combating Gnosticism. And in particular, they said that this view of the body is wrong. The human body is something precious, It's something significant partly because of creation. God has created it good, but also in particular because of incarnation and resurrection. That God has come in human form and has actually vindicated the human body by indwelling it himself. And therefore the human body is precious and significant to be celebrated, respected, protected. And of course, once Jesus is raised as a recognizable, touchable, physical, embodied human being, as various theologians have said, God has said the final yes to the original model human person, to the Mark I human body. He said that this kind of embodied physical humanity is fit to be transformed. It will become renewed. So I think that in this fascinating cultural moment that we're at, many people are feeling a sense of unease about where this is all going. Where is transhumanism going? Where is the digital world going? Where are these intelligent machines? They're feeling a sense of unease, that there's something unhealthy about this, inhumane about it. But interestingly, none of the traditional philosophical thought forms can explain why. The only well thought through, rigorous way of thinking that can explain why is Orthodox Trinitarian Christianity. That we as Orthodox Christians can say we know why the human body is important, and we know why it is not going to be transcended, ultimately because of Jesus. So as I close, some preliminary responses. I think critical vigilance. We live in a very unsettling time, a very confusing time, and therefore simplistic statements or interpretations may well be wrong. And I'm reminded of Jesus' instructions to watch and pray. Don't be afraid. Whenever God reveals himself in a new way, the first words are, fear not, don't be afraid. And I think it's easy as we look to the speed of change to think, what on earth is happening in our world? And so don't be afraid. Don't be afraid as you go into your careers, because these trends are going to become more and more significant, I suspect. There's no need to be afraid. We're confident that God's sovereign purposes are being worked out in history, and we're called to be bit players in the great drama. The parable of the wheat and the weeds, I think this is one of the most interesting and mysterious of Jesus' parables, because it seems clear that in that parable, evil and good things are intended to grow together, almost indistinguishable, intertwined. And it's only at the end of the age that it will be revealed. It will become clear ultimately what is good and what is evil. What were the works of the light and what were the works of the evil one. But actually we live in an age where these things are inextricably intertwined, and where therefore it needs enormous judgment and discernment sometimes to try and work it out. Technology is not neutral because it represents power and mastery over human nature. Therefore, it has a fundamental tendency towards control, towards manipulation, towards evil. But technology can be redeemed and used for God's purposes and intentions. A wonderful example, which I think Craig Gay talks about, and that is that way back, about 1,500 years before Christ, there was a newfangled technology which was just being developed, and it was called the phonetic alphabet. It was a man-made kind of technology which was transforming the ability to communicate. And you know what? The God of the universe, the God of the Hebrews, chose to use the newfangled phonetic technology to write the Decalogue, the words. And in fact, that technology was part of the way that he communicated his truth in written form. So there's a very interesting interweaving between God's purposes and technology. And so don't assume that God can't use technology for his own purposes, that God cannot redeem it and transform it and use it as part of the great drama. We need to celebrate original model humanity and embodied, unenhanced human nature and activity, because this is the form in which God became flesh. We need to reflect more deeply on the significance of Christ's bodily resurrection, God's final vote of confidence in our physically embodied human nature. And in an age which oscillates between techno-optimism and despair, the Christian hope of physical resurrection and cosmic transformation has a new relevance. Thanks very much.